Hey everyone, welcome to the next episode of the First Gen Psychologist. In this series, we will be covering topics that destigmatize mental health, as well as topics for personal development and empowerment centered on the First Gen experience. I'm your host, I'm Dr. Lisette. I'm a Latina First Gen psychologist, writer, speaker, coach, and like I said, today I'm your host. Something I want to add is my pronouns are she, her, ella. And I'm so excited to speak with you all today. We are meeting with an amazing person, and we will be discussing more about building strong relationships, tips for first-gen adults. So let me share a bit more about our guest. So Adriana Rodriguez, an LMFT, is a psychotherapist and relationship educator. Adriana is a queer Latinx first-generation licensed marriage and family therapist and relationship educator specializing in working with BIPOC and first-gen adult children of immigrants. With extensive experience in helping individuals, couples, and adult families navigate complex relationships, Adriana takes a holistic approach to therapy, addressing the systemic and cultural injustices and generational gifts and traumas impacting people's mental health. Passionate about cultivating empathy, vulnerability, and self-compassion, Adriana empowers clients to create fulfilling, meaningful lives and relationships. Welcome, Adriana. So happy to have you here with us today. How are you?
Good. So happy to be here with you.
Yeah, so let's jump straight into this because I
Yeah.
know we only have short time together. So let's go into it. So, what are some unique challenges first gen adults encounter when it comes to building and maintaining strong relationships?
I think there's kind of three areas that I think are specific for first gen folks that come up. And one of them being cultural differences. Cultural
Mhm.
differences inclusive of family expectations, right? That would be number two. And then number three, just sort of how do we navigate new social norms? A lot
Mhm.
of the times, one of the first gen experiences that is very unique to us is that we're like kind of like 2 feet into two lands, into like the borderlands, right? I always think about
Yeah.
Ansaldúa and like the borderlands and this idea that ni de aquí ni de allá. And so we're constantly serving as this bridge in the family traditions, but also we're having to get used to this mainstream culture that we've been kind of thrown in. And so constantly
Mhm.
as first gens, we're trying to make these decisions of like, what does my family believe? What does the church taught me? What is, back home how things would have been done, and then you're constantly confronting here this life and this Americanized, westernized sort of like way of being that is very individual. And so you're constantly having to navigate the social norms and then also being like a culture broker, because then I have to
Yeah.
go right to either my friends and tell them, well, my mama no me deja salir en la noche, right? Like I can't
Yeah.
go out at night, but then
Yeah.
then you're going to your friends and you're having to explain why. And your friends are like, but you're 26 years old. Like, why are you asking your mom? Right. And so you're
Mhm.
constantly, like, even in silly ways and small ways that may not seem like a big deal, you're constantly bridging back and forth between these two worlds and these two new cultures. And so many people, as a challenge, they struggle with this like set of unique experiences. And we have to name it that it's really a weight. It is something that you do have to carry. And so many times I find folks that I work with, and even myself in my own experiences
Yeah.
as first gen, fighting against them. And I think like the key to overcoming them is just really finding a way that authentically sort of like meshes the two worlds and merges us
Yeah.
in the best of both ways. And also like the flexibility that
Yeah.
as you learn, as you go, as you find new
Mhm.
things by yourself, that you remain open and flexible, that maybe things that you believed 5 years ago, 2 years ago, heck, 2 months ago may not be the
Mhm.
things that you're believing now.
Yeah.
And how do you kind of stay accepting of this ongoing change and this ongoing dynamic? And I think like a big part also of overcoming them is finding other people that
Yeah.
are having first gen experiences,
Yeah.
because people who are not having first gen experiences, even if they're first gen born here, there's a difference about being first gen coming to the country, first gen going to college, first gen, like there's so
Yeah.
many ways to be first gen, that
Mhm.
you find the folks that have those similar experiences that can say, oh yeah, I go through it in this way, right? May not be exactly how you go through it, but I can
Mhm.
relate to that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that, we're both first gen ourselves. And so like as I hear you talk about it, I think of just my own experiences with trying to bridge the two cultures, with being that cultural broker. And I love that the example that you gave wasn't necessarily being a cultural broker. Often we speak of it in terms of how we do that for the families, but also that culture brokering goes in the other direction when it comes to the other interactions and relationships you have. Your friends who don't understand why you have to ask for permission at a certain point, why you are constantly checking in with your family members. I still talk to my mom almost every day in some way. And a lot of people are like, wow, that's a lot. You're spending so much time talking to her. Like that seems excessive. That seems unnecessary. And
Mhm.
needing to navigate that with folks. And
Mhm.
so I know you spoke on this a little bit, but as we're thinking about relationship dynamics, are there any other particular relationship dynamics or situations that first gen adults commonly face?
I think one of the bigger ones, and I was as I was brainstorming for
Yeah.
this talk with you, I was thinking about the pressure that we feel of getting it right, of
Mhm.
meeting our family expectations,
Yeah.
but also honoring ourselves. And this can create a tension, right? A lot of the times
Yeah.
I see kind of this talk online about self-care, self-care, self-care,
Mhm.
and don't be codependent, don't be a people pleaser. And when we're just kind of saying do this or don't do that, then we're kind of missing out the nuances that in our culture, when we're talking about Latinx specifically,
Yeah.
first gens, right, that we are in the middle of like making these bridges, and that the
Mhm.
pressures of cultural differences, for example, like for me as a queer person, my family
Mhm.
not being accepting of my identity as a queer
Yeah.
person has created a ton of conflict, a ton of rupture, right? And so many first gens do find themselves in conflict and clashing with the beliefs of their family of origin, the culture from back home, with families resenting them for picking themselves and for not saying yes or setting boundaries, right? Like all this concept that many of us are seeing on Instagram, set boundaries, do this, do
Yeah.
that. What they're missing is that we're not talking about, but like, how do you remain in a positive, healthy relationship with your family as you
Yeah.
also honor yourself? And so when we're just sort of consuming material that is telling us focus on you as the individual, and we're forgetting that as first gen Latinx, Latina folks, we are still
Yeah.
very much connected to our family of origin. This differs in the family expectations. I think the other element is like what I like to call the Catholic
Mhm.
guilt, right? Or like the religious
Mhm.
Christian guilt.
Yeah.
Guilt in general shows up in
Yeah.
very different ways in relationship dynamics, right? Like, for example, I used to live like about 2 hours away from like my family. And when I lived over there, I would get the phone call, ah, no has venido a visitar, ya te olvidaste
Mhm.
de nosotros, you don't remember us, you don't think about your family, right? And here I am in the middle of like having a blast with my friends. That also is like this
Yeah.
other part of me that I enjoy. And it's not that I don't miss my family, but how do I like constantly navigate myself, right? And so guilt.
Yeah.
One thing that I see very commonly is like people that lie to their parents about who they're dating. Did
Yeah.
you move in together with your boyfriend, but you're like pretending that you didn't move in? I mean, like, this is like where religion and culture and like the
Yeah.
world are constantly clashing, right? And so what ends up happening, I think, is that many of us feel forced to hide parts of ourselves, to be
Yeah.
dishonest, to cover up some things that maybe we are afraid or realistically know are going to have serious consequences if they were to come out, right? And so this is
Mhm.
constantly creating tension.
Yeah.
And how do we set up a space in our families to have open and respectful conversations about these differences? And
Mhm.
then partner up, right? Like, how are we also preparing ourselves? Because if what we have learned to do is that to be myself, I have to do this amount of lying, this amount of
Mhm.
chameleoning out, right? Like changing the color, like
Yeah.
to meet the circumstance so that I don't have consequences,
Yeah.
then that can create also conflict between our partnerships when we're creating then our families that we choose, right? Our partners' values may be different than our values. And for example, if you're like a person that is like trying not to live together with your boyfriend until you get married, but you're trying to keep up this front to your family, but then living in capitalism, it actually is cheaper if you just live together,
Yeah.
right? How do
Yeah.
you navigate and negotiate that with your partner, with your boyfriend, girlfriend, partner that you have?
Yeah.
Because if not, we run the risk of just kind of creating a sense of self that can
Mhm.
only be honest and authentic in certain aspects, and in other ones we're relying on lying or covering
Mhm.
up, like even simple tiny lies. It's like the
Yeah.
most interesting thing about this dynamics that not all the time are big things. There can be really small, but what we do every time is that we kind of set an imprint in our soul, in our
Mhm.
hearts, in our mind, that in order to be accepted, to be loved, we have to change who we are constantly, right?
Yeah.
Chameleon out,
Yeah.
or let go of certain parts of ourselves when we're with certain people, and that can really cause some harm to like our self-identity and our
Yeah.
self-worth. And also we can fall prey to people that may be abusive of those dynamics because they
Yeah.
know that we are accustomed to not being true to ourselves.
Yeah, no, and you bring up some really important points. I think especially the guilt around how you exist in the world, especially if you're trying to prioritize some of your own needs. There's the own guilt that you feel around doing
Mhm,
that, and then there's the guilt that people place on you. I think that a lot of the communication, at least in my experience with myself and my clients, is that there's a lot of guilting in the way that we communicate, and
mhm,
I've learned to, at least in my personal work, to reframe it in my mind, because understanding, I don't know that my mom knows how else to tell me that she misses me besides
mhm,
saying like, "Ya no te veo, you never come see me anymore."
mhm,
And
mhm,
having to reframe that, it's like she's telling me she misses me, and
mhm,
that's okay. That doesn't
mhm,
necessarily, I don't have to feel bad about her missing me. It's my mom. She's always going to miss me.
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
and that's okay. And so having to find strategies that work for me, right? In other
mhm,
moments, I have found the courage to say like, "Hey, can you just tell me you miss me?
mhm,
Is that
mhm,
okay?" But yeah, that example with the guilt, absolutely, it's such a big one, such a common one, and
mhm,
and yeah, and like, and then I think earlier you were speaking on, we hear all of this, like, how do you set these boundaries? How do you do all of that? And having to figure out, like, how do you not lose your sense of self in the process
mhm,
of trying to
mhm.
navigate these boundaries? So such important points. And
a
so,
lot of a lot of the times we see it as either I pick me or I pick my family, right? And we're talking, and I like to talk about the term interdependence that a lot of people are
yeah,
not so familiar, which is kind of like the cousin, like the healthy cousin of codependence, right? Which is
okay,
interdependence. It's like I depend on my family depends on me, and this is a cycle, right? But
yeah,
inside these boundaries, what we're trying to do is to preserve our family values and respect
yeah,
and honor the people that we come from and how they see the world, right?
yeah,
With limitations, with compassion, with a lot of
yeah.
love, but that is not in sacrifice of ourselves. And that is like a
Exactly.
fine line, right? That is a fine line that
Oh,
sometimes
yeah.
we have to put some drastic measures in order for ourselves to be
Oh, yeah.
honored. But the happy medium would be, how do I go back to my parent and say, hey, like, I'm not always available to come visit. That doesn't mean that I'm not thinking about you and I don't miss you.
Mhm.
I had this going on. I'm gonna come next weekend, right? And to sort of put a little gentle stop of like, you don't have to guilt me to make me to remind me that I should come home and visit you, right? But also that I am not going to take in that guilt,
Yeah,
cancel my plans. My mom me dijo que me extraña, no me ha visto, whatever, and I'm gonna
yeah,
run. And in that way, we're not honoring ourselves and whatever needs are in those moments. So it is a fine line being
yeah,
first gen and like
absolutely.
navigating the family and the individual needs that come up.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so as we're talking about that, like, what advice, what consejos would you have for first gen adults who are struggling with building these connections, right? Maybe they're feeling too immersed in the guilt, or like overwhelmed by the guilt. Maybe that's the word I'm looking for. And they're wanting to form strong relationships, both in their personal and professional lives,
Mhm.
but they're almost immobilized, right? Like having,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, absolutely. I think first of all, it's going to take that we step out of our comfort zone. Being
Yeah.
first gen, right, already is about being a person of vision, being having to create a
Yeah.
reality, a world that doesn't exist, that hasn't existed before us, right? And I
Mhm.
think that this is where it comes in relationships.
Yeah.
When we are growing up, so how we learn about relationship education and why I'm passionate about
Yeah.
relationship education is because we don't realize that we're learning by what we're seeing and what we're consuming on TV and the media, but also the dynamics that we're seeing in our families,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So we can tend to romanticize some
Yeah.
of the relationships that we see without having a critical eye about the why those relationships are happening in the way that
Mhm.
they happen. And so first sort of step that I take with everybody that I work with is like self-awareness. What are your own values? What do you believe about relationships? What do you think is right or wrong about being in relationship with others, like going in, right? Because if we have been just listening to what the world is saying constantly, then have I had the opportunity to have that conversation with myself, like what do I want and what do I want my relationships to be, right? And so
Mhm.
after that, being able to be vulnerable and also being critical, not that we're criticizing, but critical thinking about like, well, I saw that happen in my family, why might have that dynamic happen in my family? a lot of us learned to be in romantic relationships from people who were incredibly stressed and who were
Mhm.
in survival mode.
Mhm.
So, me nowadays, right, I'm like, I have acquired some privilege. My education
Yeah.
has acquired, allowed me
Yeah.
privilege. My partner also has privilege, right? So, but if the
Yeah.
way that I am running my relationship is permeated by
Yeah.
all these examples that I saw, people who were highly stressed,
Yeah.
it's not going to match, right? And so,
Oh yeah.
taking that step back and being able to say, like, well, how do I want to be in relationship first and foremost? What are the things
Mhm.
that I've seen in the media that are about romanticizing? A lot of us have like this romantic ideas about what love is supposed to be.
Yeah.
Sometimes love is really boring and it's about deciding who's gonna wash the dishes. Like
Yeah.
literally. Who's gonna pack
Oh
the
yeah.
lunch for tomorrow? Who's gonna walk the dogs, right? Those
Yeah.
things also happen in relationships. And is that healthy
Yeah.
negotiation? But if we have been influenced not only by our family of origin and their trauma, being in
Yeah.
survival mode, but also the gender binary, right? Like this is what men
Mhm.
do, this is what women do, this is what
Oh
how
yeah.
women feel, this is how men feel. Well, do you have to? Like, is that the way that you want to build your family, right? So for me, like the advice of building connections is like, don't rush any process. You're not gonna
Yeah.
fall in love. You're not gonna lose this person in like your first date. Like that's just not gonna happen. Can you
Yeah.
start building a connection and then can you start questioning how am I in this relationship or friendship
Mhm.
even, right? Like, is this a healthy friend for me? Is this friend like making me
Yeah.
feel constantly worried about that they're gonna leave me or they're inconsistent, right? How do those things, why
Yeah.
am I accustomed to them? Is it because I saw them in my family of origin, right? And being
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
understanding what feels good to me
Yeah.
as part of being first gen and being coming from like uh inheritance of generational trauma. Sometimes one of the byproducts of that is the
Yeah.
shutting down of the voice, like that gut feeling in our intuition that we do know what feels
Yeah.
right and what doesn't feel right if we listen, but
Yeah.
likely there's been noise around the things that we've seen that tells us
Oh yeah.
otherwise. Taking ourselves back to that self-awareness of like,
Mhm.
what do I want? How do I want to show up?
Yeah.
What feels good to me? That's where I would begin.
Yeah, no, I love that. Like centering yourself within your needs, which is really hard when you've been taught to center everyone else's needs above yours constantly, right? There's that. And then I love that you bring up the example of romanticizing because I always talk about this. So my theory is telenovelas. My theory is that telenovelas have hugely impacted my perception of relationships. And like when I was a kid, exactly, that was I would watch this and I was like, oh, I'm gonna get rescued. Usually, like, and by a very wealthy man somewhere, but then he's gonna cheat on me with my twin sister, and then I'm gonna, and then I listen to all of these things, and I was like, what is happening, right? But that was the image and the idea of like what relationships could look like. And as a child, I'm like, oh, it establishes a norm. And I know
Mhm,
maybe talking about it as an adult, you're like, it's common sense. Some people
mhm,
might say that that's not how relationships are. But when you don't, but when all of the examples of different relationships in your life are like
mhm,
this, even outside of the telenovelas, seeing like, oh, it's just that we love intensely, so we fight intensely. It's like
mhm.
that's not okay. uh, but some people believe that,
Yeah.
and
Or we
we
make
yeah.
excuses and
Mhm.
we justify behaviors that are unhealthy because we've seen them over and over. And we don't
Exactly.
question them because we've normalized them as like, well, everybody that I love fights como que se odian, right? Like they're just
Yeah.
go at
Oh
cutthroat.
yeah.
And it's like, well, actually, conflict can be helpful and beautiful and
Oh yeah.
healthy. It
Yeah.
doesn't have to be vindictive and vile.
Yeah.
But if that is all we've seen, then we run the risk of living like a telenovela when real life is not a telenovela.
Real life is not a telenovela unless I mean, if our telenovelas get a bit more progressive, then I'll be on board. But for now, no. So
There is no white man who's rich is coming to save you, y'all. I'm so sorry. Like that's not how it works.
I'm rescuing myself
That's
out of
right.
these thought
I'm the man that's
patterns.
rescuing myself.
We are breaking the generational cycles of trauma, and this is part of it, and beginning to center ourselves or ground ourselves in the
Mhm.
reality that, like,
Yeah.
like you said, relationships can be boring and
Yeah.
love can be boring, and not being in a cycle of stress and survival might feel uncomfortable because we're used to that, but we don't we are can find so much more peace when we
Yeah.
exit that, and that's so beautiful. And so as we're talking about peace and healthy relationships, I want to make sure we end on a note to, like, encourage folks. And so what are some signs of healthy and strong relationships that first generation adults should look out for? Or these, I guess, white flags? Are they pink flags?
I call them green
Green
flags.
flags? I was like, what is
We call
it?
them
Yeah,
green
green.
flags. So
Yeah.
I think when I want to say that sometimes I have to watch myself, that I'm like, first gen, we're full of trauma and everything. It's like we have to dismantle it. But the reality is that also our families have endured so much. And the
Yeah.
reason that they've endured so much has also created incredible strengths. And
Yeah.
in that awareness of like, what is it that feels good to me about seeing relationships, I
Yeah.
want people go back and think about their families and not only look for the red flags and the things that
Yeah.
we over romanticize or they're like toxic and whatnot, but also what are the gifts that
Yeah.
keep this relationship strong, right?
Yeah.
Mutual respect,
Yeah.
trust, communication, being able to resolve conflict constructively, being able to maintain relationships despite the hardships that are coming through,
Yeah.
right? Consistency, right? Like that, no matter what happens, you know that these people are gonna be there in your life. And so when we're thinking about
Yeah.
red flags, they're easy. I mean,
Yeah.
oh well, I have to say they're easy because a lot of us are talking about them online. We're seeing them and we're becoming more
Yeah.
aware of them. But I think
Exactly.
it's important. And I always tell this to my clients. We're saying a lot, I don't want this, I don't want that, I don't want this, I don't want that. So what do you want instead? And oftentimes people get kind of like stuck because we're so worried about keeping the what we don't want out that we haven't been able to ask ourselves, but then what
Mhm.
does it look otherwise, right?
Yeah.
So mutual respect, trust, openness, consistency, those are some of the things that I recommend people to be looking at, to be aware of any red flags, though, like manipulation, any inconsistency, any disrespect, any violence, any boundary violations, any consent violations, right? We want to be thinking critically about both the gifts and the traumas or the hardships that have come out from our families, but we don't want to dismiss that our families and ourselves already have in us all the
Mhm.
ingredients to be healthy. And this will be the
Yeah.
point if we want to have a support network of friends or a
Yeah.
therapist, colleagues, right? That we're thinking and talking about, hey, like this happened in my relationship.
Yeah.
How are you seeing that, right? Because when we have those trusting people that can give us a glimpse into what else could be or what should not be
Yeah.
acceptable, a lot of the times la vergüenza, la pena, right, the guilt, like we're just ashamed of
Yeah.
sometimes naming that relationships are hard and that
Yeah.
sometimes two people who are first gen get together and they have a lot of red flags together, and so it becomes a red flag. And so how do we, with our partners, with our friends, we're like, hey, I didn't like how that went, I did not like how we resolved that conflict, I did not feel
Yeah.
respected, and I feel that I can't communicate with you about what's going
Yeah.
on with me because there could be consequences. And so it's like a fine balance of not
Yeah.
only focus what the red flags are, but also like what are the positive, the healthy things that you want to bring. And I think it's Gottman that has an exercise that
Mhm.
Gottman is about romantic relationships. And one of the exercises to sit with your partner and ask, what are the gifts from our families of origin that we want to bring into this relationship, and get really
Yeah.
intentional, because it's likely that you already have role models of
Mhm.
people who have been in healthy relationships. So we want to be careful and not dismiss
Yeah.
our, the our parents' histories or our families of origin histories, because there also is this extreme amount of trauma at times, or like unhealthy dynamics. Like
Yeah.
what are the things that you bring forward, and what do you want to
Yeah.
leave behind?
Exactly. And I love that because I think sometimes we can be so focused, especially because of everything you see online and the messaging around like we're healing, we're healing, we're healing, we're
Mhm,
breaking these cycles, and recognizing that we also have a lot of the tools to
mhm,
heal. We've learned a lot about that within.
mhm.
Then there's the ancestral healing component as well. And so
Absolutely.
needing to look into that. And with that, I think the something that I think resonated with me throughout our whole conversation was the mutual respect,
Mhm,
because if you have mutual respect, you will listen to someone when they come up to you to share the a grievance that they have, so
mhm,
something that made them uncomfortable,
mhm,
and can approach that with that openness and saying like, I respect this person enough to give them that time to
mhm,
listen. I hope this
mhm.
person respects me enough to give,
Right.
like to reciprocate as well. So
Right.
as we're ending, how can we support you in your work, Adriana? So I'm gonna
Well,
go.
I want to support you by, so I actually, one of the reasons that I've separated my psychotherapy kind of work that I do with couples and people's in relationships is also that I think we don't have a lot of enough sources where we're doing relationship education. Where do you learn to be in relationship with others? So actually, I host a relationship boot camp that I do like a couple of times a year, where it's just about skills. It's like almost like guided self-help, where I'm coming
Yeah.
in and giving like some tips, and people I'm getting ready to release the next round this June, July. Is a
Okay.
4-part boot camp that I focus in self-awareness, communication and boundaries, conflict management, and keeping the spark alive in our relationships. And so
Yeah.
if anybody felt interested in the conversation that we're having, I know I also on social media, my focus is only relationship health. I really think that sometimes we do get harmed through relationships, but also
Mhm.
tremendous healing can happen in the relationships, and not
Yeah.
only romantic, but even our friendships, our chosen family, our
Yeah.
siblings, right? Where we have opportunities to repair. So there is that. And then also my psychotherapy work. I'm in California. So if you're in the state of California, then you can reach out potentially to work with me in couples therapy or in relationship therapy. I also do adult family therapy, which is like where I have adult parents or adult siblings come to therapy together to be able
Yeah.
to get intentional about their relationships. And so my website is adrianarodrigueztherapy.com. So it's very simple. And then you can find me on Instagram, Adriana Rodriguez Wellness. And I am all about relationships. That's my jam.
No, I love that. Yeah, our relationship, I think that when it comes to our mental health, there's so many different components. And, as a mental health professional, we all have our different specialties, right?
Mhm.
And like relationship work is such a unique field within our field. And so I wanted to just reiterate, like, you all want to learn more about relationships, you should go to one of Adriana's was it a workshop, that 4-part series? Were you
Yeah,
calling
it's a
it
workshop. I
a
usually
workshop
call it a
series?
boot camp because I
Boot
just want to
camp.
get people on, like, come on, let's go. Like, I
Get
think
your
this is
healthy
important. Let's do
relationship
it.
done.
But it's a workshop. I'm not gonna make you do push-ups. You can just come and like learn about relationships.
You can learn.
Hard
Again, be
push-ups
so
is like
fit, mentally fit at the end of the
mentally
day.
fit.
That's
There
what
you go.
it is.
That's the idea.
Mental fitness is that, and then obviously the individual and
Yes.
family therapy. And then are you completely virtual? Do you do anything in person? Just so that I have, yeah.
I'm here in Sacramento, and so people that are in Sacramento, I see them in person, and then I do
Okay.
virtual all over California.
Awesome.
And then the
Awesome.
boot camp, because it is educational, anyone from anywhere can join. So if you don't have the chance to work with me because you're not in California for individual therapy or family therapy and whatnot,
Mhm.
you can always come to the boot camp because it is educational. So it's open to everybody.
Awesome. Well, Adriana, thank you so much. It's been
Thank
so
you.
lovely to have you here. And thank you all for those of you who tuned in live. Please share this with anyone who you think might benefit from this. And as always, the First Gen Psychologist is on every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And so subscribe to not miss another episode. But thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.